for everyone, without fear that these norms would appear Eurocentric. Within these limits, you argue for the unconditional toleration of difference in different forms of life. So if, as you write, most of the refugees come from a culture that is incompatible with Western European notions of rights, who do you think will decide on the bundle of rights and norms that would be applicable to all? And what organizational body will coordinate and execute this logistical task of resettlement? Lastly, what role do you envision states, the traditional nation state, playing in the global coordination and organizational effort?
My first point is that I'm totally opposed to this idea that in our neoliberal times, the role of the states is less and less important and so on. I think states are more important than ever. Because, for example, if 100 years ago you wanted to establish a company, you basically just needed the state to guarantee the rule of law. Today you have education, ecological measures, and so on and so on. And especially with refugees, we see how even nation states are not enough. We desperately need a transnational, larger, big organization. I think that the left should stop with that horror of, there is two things are passé. They belong to 20th century, we know. The Stalinist really existing socialism, and also the good old, it was good as long as it lasted, today it no longer obviously works, the good old welfare state. That's over. But there is a third dream which still persists. The dream of this anti-representative local democracy, you know, people organizing directly their life, coordinating it. You can call this a communal life, local democracy, whatever. This will not do the work. It is more and more clear that this is the first myth we should abandon. I had friends in Venezuela, other places, even in Spain, they have cooperatives. But you know, to have a good cooperative or local communities which work, there must be a very efficient state behind which organizes water, electricity, health, education, and so on and so on. So when people ask me, what's my political ideal? I shamelessly like to say more alienation. Are we aware that precisely if we want to enjoy this local life, locally democratic, many things has to happen, has to function beyond outside our visibility. And this is especially clear at the level of ecology. Listen, I don't believe in this ideology of making us, local people, feel guilty and then don't just criticize what did you do about it. Did you recycle your Coke cans? Did you set aside our paper to be recycled and so on and so on? Of course we should do this. But I think this operation of making us feel responsible individually and then at the same time offering us an easy way out. Basically, the message is, do properly your recycling, buy some stupid organic apples and so on, and you did your duty. That's not enough. In what is happening now, mega acts will be sooner or later required. Like a good friend of mine, the theorist of catastrophes who teaches at Stanford, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, was in Fukushima 2 days after that earthquake and tsunami. And he told me, you know that for one day, Japanese authorities were in total panic because it looked as if they will have to evacuate the entire Tokyo area, 30 million people. How do you do this? Who will organize? So we will have to move even beyond this organization. That's the first myth of the left that should be dropped. The second myth is this leftist pathetic admiration of big assemblages. Oh my God, 1 million people there on Tahrir Square, on Gaza Square, wherever you want, or in Madrid and so on. That's nice, this collective display, demonstration. But isn't it that what the left is needing today is not so much to organize these big emphatic events, but what I call the organization of what to do, how do you say, after an alcoholic evening, the morning after. You know, these emphatic moments are nice, but they are limited in time. The true social change is for me not this wonderful, we all cry, promise, you see people protest, but how will ordinary people feel the change when things return to normal? That's why I hope our viewers know the movie. I didn't like it. V for Vendetta. You know how the movie ends.
The ending, it's the morning, the morning after, yeah.
Sorry? Yes,
the morning after.
Yeah, just people break into the parliament, the people take over. As I like to say, in an obscene way, of course, I'm ready to sell my mother into slavery to see a movie called V for Vendetta Part 2. But what happens the day after when the people take over? Because as I heard on TV in the United States also now, if one is to believe your president, the people took over. No? What I mean is, what measures, what do we want? We see capitalism is approaching a crisis. Ecologically, with refugees, who will control biogenetics, intellectual property, and so on. But with what to replace it, how to reform it, we don't have a vision. That's for me what is behind all this. My big desire is this, let's call it, away from these big pathetics of protest, of performances, to reorganization of the everyday life.
So 2 questions follow. One, I guess, would be, are the existing transnational organizations like the UN and NATO, are they capable of doing this big infrastructural task?
I'm here extremely pragmatic. I would say like this, in principle, no, but maybe you never know. Even NATO, I wouldn't write it off totally. NATO is, we know what it is. But there may be a situation where something like NATO, which is nonetheless a transnational military force, can do some good work. And let's return to your first question, the refugees. It's not that I'm a militarist. My idea of using NATO was not to protect the fortress Europe, but to do the transfer of refugees, and I cannot emphasize the importance of this, in an organized way. What effectively happened was a catastrophe when hundreds of thousands were just chaotically walking, even through my country, Greece, Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia.
Norway and Russia.
The result was incredible profits of smuggling organizations. The estimates are about 10 billions of dollars, plus the incredible rise of local racisms, resistances. And not that I agree with this horror of ordinary people, but my God, I can understand them. There were farmers in Slovenia who literally awakened. There are 2,000 people in your front yard, no organization, and so on. So precisely on behalf of the welfare of refugees, one has to organize things. If not, my God, we will have the anti-immigrant right. Pegida in Germany, Le Pen in France, UKIP in Germany. We will have them ruling Europe. Europe will pay the price of it. All that is good in European legacy, enlightenment, universal rights, and so on, is threatened. Point 2, let me go further. When you mentioned human rights, I don't agree. And I think this was not what Marx meant with this old stupid pseudo-Marxist doxa. Human rights are abstract rights. In reality, they cover up, they privilege secretly, whatever, men of wealth, white men, and so on. Of course, this is true. But from the very beginning, precisely because of their abstract nature, human rights had a genuinely subversive potential. Look, they began as, of course, human rights. Effectively, it meant at the beginning the rights of the white people of property, usually men, and so on. But it immediately exploded. Mary Wollstonecraft, and so women said, why not us? Haiti, the greatest thing, I think, greater, more important than French Revolution, Haiti Revolution. Black people said there, we also want it. And the greatness of Haiti Revolution is that they didn't want any shitty return to their roots, Alex Haley roots. We leave this to Hollywood, no? They wanted a modern democratic republic like the French, and so on. So I think that we should definitely not just condemn human rights. I'm the first to agree that human rights are often used as a mask to cover particular Western interests and so on and so on. But nonetheless, there is an explosive potential in them. Second thing that you said, this incompatibility of ways of life. I don't mean this in a stupid Eurocentric sense, like we Europeans are more civilized, they are primitive. I'm just saying first that there are obvious problems. Each community has a certain way of life, which is not so much abstract ideology in what God you believe, but which determines these everyday routines, how women are treated, children, relations of authority, and so on and so on. And it is absolutely crucial to prevent tensions, to establish explicit rules to talk about all this openly. The catastrophe in Europe was that the liberal left prefers not to talk about it. If you mention these problems, you are already Islamophobic, racist, and so on. And the result is what? That you get, Marine Le Pen, UKIP, and so on and so on. All I'm saying is, let's recognize that there is a problem here. For example, in Germany, you have thousands of girls every year who escape their family because they fell in love with a German boy or whatever. They want to live the usual Western, more open, permissive, hedonist daily life. Then, of course, their families want them back. They go to the police. You have to do something here. And I just think it would be good to have the rules, to set some limits. Like, okay, you live your way of life, but what do we do if a girl in despair turns to police? I don't see anything racist in it. When you said, but which rule we will establish here?
Who decides on the bundles of rights, norms, and values? I mean, I'm trying to sort of situate that position vis-a-vis like a Rawls bundle of rights or Habermasian deliberative democracy kind of bundle of rights that we, it's the continuation of the Kantian Rousseauian Enlightenment project as to settle that question once and for all.
I don't want to go into that debate now, but I must say although I'm very critical of Habermas and not Rawls, but at this level, I'm more on their side than on the side of these cultural particularisms. Like we have all different ways of life and so on and so on. No, I think that the very multiculturalists who demand respect for particular ways of life already argue in a European way, as part of European tradition and so on. And why shouldn't we use this tradition? I'm not abstractly against Eurocentrism, because what we tend to forget that those who criticize Eurocentric racism and so on do it in a way which is directly in accordance with the basic principles of Enlightenment and so on and so on.
Right.
I'm well aware of all the horrors that Europe did. But I think that the fact that today anti-Eurocentrism is so popular is an effect of a much darker phenomenon, the decline of meaningful democracy, civil freedoms, and so on. Isn't it clear that even in the United States now in Trump, not to mention Russia, India, China, and so on, a new political form of capitalism is emerging, a much more authoritarian capitalism. This is the true danger for me. We can call it, which is a racist term, I don't like it, capitalism with Asian values or whatever. But, and even we feel this in daily lives because we feel free. If you ask an average citizen today, okay, you feel free if you feel free, but in what sense are you free? It's mostly the freedom of choice. Well, I can read whatever I want, I can travel where I want, I can get a job that I want, here already begins, if you can get it. But my point is, this is not enough in European tradition, and not only European, even other traditions, to define freedom. Freedom for me is not just the freedom of choice within the existing scope, panoply of possibilities. Freedom at a more radical level means also to change the very frame. Not just freedom of choice within, because isn't this our basic paradox in the West today, that the more we emphasize these intimate freedoms of sexual freedom, whatever, the larger social process is becoming more or less totally impenetrable. Nobody knows what is happening. Big decisions are made by experts and so on and so on. This is what makes me suspicious about all this LGBT and separated toilet stuff. Of course, I'm for them. But my God, isn't it that those in power are offering this as topics of debate to obfuscate the big economic transnational choices of how global capitalism functions and so on? We don't even debate about that. Without this, we are lost. We are approaching to a new authoritarian society. That's why I disagree with those who claim, oh, with Trump, we are in fascism. It's not as simple as that. Donald Trump as president is, for me, the paradox of, let's call it, liberal fascism. In the sense that at individual level, you can buy pornography, maybe even take drugs, whatever. All that is kept. But nonetheless, the power relations are more impenetrable than ever. That's the problem for me. And back to refugees, which is why, my last point, I also don't agree with this unilateral emphasis of humanitarian aspect. Like, oh my God, do we Europeans still have a heart? Hundreds of thousands waiting there. Can we just watch it and so on? I agree we should be more open there. But my God, what we need is a much larger social, economic, geopolitical vision. We all agree that the solution is not just, let's open our borders, they all come to Europe. The solution is to change international economic relations, geopolitical relations, and so on. And here, of course, Europe is responsible, and United States. Like the recent wave of refugees from Syria and Iraq. Let's be clear, without Syrian war, which is war between superpowers fought by proxies, and Iraq occupation, we wouldn't have probably this wave of refugees. It's the same, although it doesn't appear the same in northern Africa. We can now clearly see that the violent overthrow of Gaddafi, of course he was a despicable person, but nonetheless, was a geopolitical catastrophe. And are we aware what is happening in Africa at a silent, invisible level, like big food companies? And here it's more Arab countries and some Asian countries like Japan who are guilty. They're buying the best tracts of land for export industrial plants and so on, and introducing then chaos, forcing people to flee and so on and so on. That's all I'm pleading for. Don't make it just a humanitarian problem. Approach it as geopolitical and economic problem. If we don't do this, we will just bring this humanitarianism to the end. We will get a chaotic situation where we will all be losers, refugees and we in Western Europe.
Maybe we could transition to speaking